Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and I just kind of wanted to share with you a current project. Now I need to preface this project by saying I am not promising at all to complete it. It's mostly just, I'm sharing this with you just to share some thoughts and just let you know what's going on and some of the things that have been occupying my time. But yeah, I'm not at all promising to finish this. I just kind of want to share some thoughts with you and let you guys know what's going on. But anyways, I'm kind of thinking about getting back into doing some textual critical stuff, which was actually kind of how my YouTube channel got started, and I'm not abandoning the other things, of course, but just trying to kind of recapture a little bit of the original flavor of what I was doing and getting back into textual critical work. And before I get into that, though, let me go ahead and review one that I've already done and kind of start from there. Back when I was first starting my YouTube channel, one of the things that I was trying to do was put information out there about the reliability of the biblical texts. And so one of the things that I did is I went through the United Bible Society's 5th edition of the Greek New Testament and was trying to see just how certain regarding the New Testament text we are. And I used the United Bible Society's 5th edition because it actually gives great levels of confidence to each of the variants that it possesses, and it's also a translator's text. So the variants that it includes are ones that are relevant to translation, not just scholarly academic work like the Nestle Aland 28th, and certainly not exhaustive like the ECM, but instead it's something that would be useful in terms of, can we trust a given translation given that it's based on such and such text. The UBS 5 works real well for that, for the most part, and most of the UBS 5 is based on fairly conventional textual critical work, except for the portion that is on the what is it called? The general epistles, the Catholic epistles. Except for that portion, most of it's pretty classical textual critical work. In the case of the Catholic epistles, so things like James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, those are the Catholic epistles. In those cases, they started employing results that came from CBGM, and a lot of you guys know that I'm not a big fan of CBGM, and I have been studying it a little bit, and finished Wasserman and Gurry's book on it and those kinds of things. And I was actually very pleased to note that they admit that there's actually quite a few problems with CBGM that frankly still haven't really been fixed yet. But I'll get into that in a bit. But what I was doing at this point, and this was actually quite a while ago, what I was doing is basically just figuring out what the average confidence level was as per the UBS 5. And what I found was that we were basically 99.4% confident as to the New Testament text as per the UBS 5. And just some quick at-a-glance types of things. The UBS 5 ranks its variants from A down to diamond now, and that diamond is added because of CBGM. CBGM has actually made things less less confident, not more confident, which is not the way that things really should be going. If you have a method that's better, it should not decrease certainty, but that's exactly what it's done, is it's decreased certainty, because there's places where CBGM has gone in the face of conventional textual criticism, flown in the face of conventional textual criticism to a great degree. And so what's happening right now, the UBS 5 just reflects changes in the Catholic epistles. So the diamond level variants are still very small as far as the number of them, and overall in the text there was about 35 words that were affected by diamond level variants and 38 that were D level variants. So very, very, very small when you're talking about a text of about 138,000 words. So right now it's not much, but as as they start including more information from CBGM, the diamond and D categories are going to start to grow, and the C category is also probably going to start to grow. The B category is probably going to stay pretty much the same, and the A category is going to start to decrease. So A is going to decrease, C down through diamond, those will probably increase a little bit. So on the whole, in the future with the UBS text, I would expect the overall confidence to diminish rather than increase. As of the UBS 5, the average confidence was 99.4. We're probably going to see that change with later editions because of CBGM. And I do like this final graph right here. This is a pretty good representation that lets people know what's going on. That is, we are functionally certain as far as translation is concerned. There's still a lot of technicalities you could talk about, but as far as functionally certain, as far as things that are going to affect translation in any major way, we're functionally certain about over 95% of the Greek New Testament text. And then as far as our confidence levels after that, A down through diamond. A is, of course, the largest category of confidence as far as number of words that are in that category, followed by B, and then C, D on down. So A, B, and C are, of course, the largest categories, like I said. C is going to start growing, D is going to start growing, the diamond is going to start growing with later additions. But this is kind of the overall picture of it. The vast majority of the New Testament text we are functionally certain about. But the other part, yeah, we're still kind of figuring out that, and like I said, those parts will be changing a little bit in the future with CBGM. And like I said, I am very critical of CBGM, and you look at people who are in the know about it, and they bring up a lot of the same issues. And one of the biggest issues with CBGM and any of these methods is that they make the mistake of thinking that similarity is relatedness, that just because things are similar, they must be related to each other. And that's a very common assumption. You see it done in, say, biological evolutionary studies all the time. And of course, you guys would hopefully know by now that I'm not an evolutionist, so I'm not going to agree with that kind of thinking at all. Just because things are similar does not mean that they're related. And it also goes into textual studies as well, and that also annoys me, especially being a biblical Christian, because a lot of people that do studies of similarity and difference and those kinds of things do it in the side of what is called stylometric analysis when it comes to the New Testament. And stylometric analysis is hugely problematic. It really is. It's the basis that a lot of people have used for arguing that certain books in the New Testament don't really belong, that Paul didn't really write 1st and 2nd Timothy and things like that. And they're based on an analysis of style and statistically looking at how similar and different the different books are. And they say, well, this book is significantly different, and therefore it was probably written by a different author, and therefore it's not really a true part of the New Testament. This is something that came later. If you include it in the New Testament, you're including it by tradition, not because of who originally wrote it. It wasn't actually written by who it claims to be. It's a forgery. Stylometric analysis, I'll be straight up here, is junk science. It is. Stylometric analysis is junk science. And I'm saying this as someone who was trained in mathematics and in statistics. I've taken statistical courses in college. I know what's going on. And it's that basic assumption that similarity is relatedness. If two documents are statistically similar enough, they're assuming that they're related. That is a false assumption. That is not something that actually holds. You can use stylometric analysis if the basis holds, but there is no basis for that. You can do studies of various people's works over time, and you will find places where stylistically, as far as percentages of this word used or that word used and those kinds of things, they're actually very different, but because we have the history and because we know who wrote what, we actually know that it was the same author who penned the same thing. For example, there was a study that was done of the James Joyce canon of literature. And according to stylometric analysis, it was written by multiple authors. But of course, we know that it was all one author because it's all James Joyce. And if you were to take another work, say Samuel Clemens' Huckleberry Finn, a lot of you guys would know him as Mark Twain, but if you take his work and you break up Huckleberry Finn by the person who's speaking, so the different characters in the story as well as the narrator, if you break that all apart, and of course it's Huckleberry Finn, so Huck is the narrator basically, but if you break it all apart according to who's speaking, what you're going to get is that stylistically all of the different speakers are very, very, very different. So does that mean that different people wrote the different parts of Huckleberry Finn? No, that's absolutely junk science. And my Mormon friends try to use stylometric analysis to support the Book of Mormon. They take the different parts of the Book of Mormon and the different people who are speaking in the Book of Mormon. They separate it all out according to those categories and say, hey, each book is a little bit different. Each of the people who speak in the Book of Mormon is a little bit different. They're mathematically, statistically, significantly different, and therefore the Book of Mormon represents real distinction, and therefore it wasn't just written by one author. It wasn't just written by Joseph Smith. It was actually something that he translated. It wasn't something that he composed, is their argument. But like I said, stylometric analysis is junk science. There is no reality to it. Just because things are similar or because things are very distinct does not mean that they're related or unrelated. And that's the same problem that I have with the coherence-based genealogical method. And so one of the things that I'm looking at right now, and I'm not saying that I'm going to finish this, but one of the things that I'm looking at right now is kind of doing kind of a comprehensive systemization of a lot of things that have existed so far. In conventional textual criticism, there's two basic principles that apply, and one is the principle of weight. In conventional textual criticism, you weigh manuscripts. Now, there are people who disagree with that, majority texters, and then there's also the ecclesiastical texters, which is basically uses the church as the standard. Whatever the church has come to use or accept, that's what we go with, which is a really circular standard. But there are people who are majority texters who don't weigh the manuscripts. They basically count the manuscripts, and there's a little bit more to it than that, of course. But just as an overview, the reading that is most common would be assumed to be the correct one in that kind of view. There's lots of problems with that, and one of the biggest problems with the majority text is that the majority text is something that floats through time. What is in the majority today is not what was in the majority a millennium ago. It just isn't, at least as far as any of the actual textual manuscript evidence that we have is. And because of that, most textual critics are not convinced by majority text arguments because, like I said, it changes with time. It depends on what's most popular at the given time. And ecclesiastical textism, and even though it isn't technically majority textism, it can still shift with time because it depends on the church. It's what the church has either come to accept, or in some people's minds, and this one definitely does produce more stability, but it still has some time problems, is that it's what the church accepted at a given point in time. Well, then the question becomes, why is that particular time better than any other particular time? And it kind of self-implodes. So aside from those people that have some very fundamental problems, like it changing depending on what date you pick, most other textual critics would start off with the principle of weighing manuscripts, and generally such that earlier manuscripts are to be preferred over later ones. And after you make that generalization, then and you say, okay, this body of manuscripts is going to be more reliable than the others. Then after you get that body of generally reliable manuscripts, and that's actually somewhat hard to figure out exactly, is what is the body of generally reliable manuscripts. And that's going to differ depending on who you talk to. And so you whittle down your body whittle down all the available manuscripts they have down to something that's a little bit more workable. And then from there, you go through and you do kind of another analysis on top of that. So you kind of do a general purge in weighing manuscripts, and then after that, you go through and you start analyzing what is specifically reliable and not reliable in each case. And unfortunately, that depends a lot on the person who's looking at the text. A lot of textual critics these days would all agree that there are certain manuscripts that are out there that are weighty, that are worth considering, that should be considered. But as to which one which reading from that set of manuscripts they're going to accept is going to differ depending on how each one interprets the specific situations that's going on. So what I am wanting to do is to take a few different New Testament texts that have been produced and kind of get an idea of what is happening in the consensus view. So here on the left I have not nearly finished, but what I've started to do is go through and take some of the major textual variants that are out there and see where textual scholarship up to this point, not counting CBGM and a lot of the computer models, but taking textual criticism to this point and seeing what textual critics generally agree on. And I'm focusing here on significant variants because significant variants, ones that have a big impact on meaning and especially that will impact translation, you would not expect them to follow the same pattern as a lot of other variants. A lot of other variants that are things like, spelling errors and simple typographical errors and those kinds of things. Those kinds of errors are going to occur in a very natural, very unnoticed kind of way that frankly actually CBGM is actually really good at catching. And CBGM as it stands right now would be very good for basically non-significant variants. But the problem with significant variants is that there's going to be a theological and also emotional baggage that is attached to them. So for example, one of the more famous variants, and it's interesting that the sources that I looked at are actually all agreed on this one, and this is all people who use conventional textual criticism. Just so you know, I'm using the United Bible Society's text before CBGM was introduced, so the UBS 5 in all places except for the general epistles, and then in the general epistles I have to go to the UBS 4. Okay, so that's one set of sources, and then another set of sources is the recent New Testament text that was put out by Tyndale House. So I'm comparing those two to each other, and then on top of that I'm putting in Philip Comfort's commentary on the text of the New Testament and using all three of them, and where all three of them are in agreement, at least implicit agreement, because the commentary, Philip's commentary, doesn't go through every single thing that's available in the other ones. But what I'm assuming is that where he didn't bother to mention something, that he's in general agreement with the others, or at least close enough that we could count them the same. But basically, all that's in this list here, and like I said, I haven't finished. I'm just through part of Matthew. But what is in the list here is places where all of these different sources are in agreement as to what the text should read. And like I said, one of the famous ones is Matthew 6:13, which is the end of the Lord's Prayer, which in the, you might say, the ecclesiastical text has kind of an extra ending. And it would go through the Lord's Prayer, and at the end of it, there's usually, it has something to the effect of, "For thine is the power and the glory forever and ever, amen," something to that effect, and it actually changes a little bit depending on what manuscript you're looking at and place in history, but something to that effect. And all of these people who start out by weighing texts and then looking through the material specifically, all of them agree that that is a place where that extra part is in fact extra. It is in fact an addition. And so what I'm trying to do, what I want to do, like I said, I might not have enough time for this, I might not ever get around to finishing it, but what I want to do is figure out all the places where they're in agreement, because these people have radically different methods of determining the earliest text. Philip Comfort, for example, his is basically whatever the earliest attested reading is. That's what he goes with. And then there's the UBS text, United Bible Societies, and they are thoroughgoing eclectic people. And so theirs have a certain amount of weight for early texts, but there's also a lot of internal probabilities that they examine as well. And then there's also the Tyndale House people, and the Tyndale House people are on the eclectic side, and they are kind of on the early side, but they also have a certain amount of distrust for the really early manuscripts like the papyri. And so between them, there's lots of things that they do not have in common. You see, I got through Matthew 19 here, and I only found 76 places out of using those sources. I didn't use more extensive ones. These are just basic significant variants. But as far as the basic significant variants are concerned, I only found 76 places up through Matthew 19 where they're all in agreement. But like I said, the point is, after I figure out all the places where they're in agreement, I want to go through and actually analyze all the variants in terms of what these people are agreed on as being generally reliable manuscripts, and then see if there's any specific patterns that you can apply to it that would kind of help fill in the gaps on the places where they're in disagreement. That is, if we apply the same standard that we have here in all the places where they do agree, and you applied that same standard in places where they don't agree, could you actually come up with a definite answer? And that would take up a lot of analysis and a lot of time, but that's what I'm trying to do. So list all the places where they're in agreement first, and then I would go through all the manuscript evidence. And there's lots of manuscripts that I have lined up here, and I'm actually going to have to wind up adding some to it because there's some manuscripts that actually have multiple readings in them. But so far, I have 498 textual witnesses that I want to examine, including church fathers. And you'll see a lot of these ones at the end are church fathers. And what I want to do is, after I've looked at all of those, basically figure out which ones are the most important. And I've tried to exclude as many textual witnesses as I can that I thought would be somewhat feasible, and 500 is still pretty much I've never undertaken a project that big. That is a lot of witnesses to have to go through, so I'm going to have all the data over here and all the data over here to analyze, and like I said, I'm still going to have to add more to this. But the reason why I picked this particular data set is first of all, it is smaller than all of the textual witnesses you could talk about, because there's literally thousands upon thousands and even tens of thousands of textual witnesses you could talk about. But there's no way that I could possibly get through all of that, so I'm limiting the data basically to what is readily available to me with using things like the UBS-5 and things like that, because that cites a lot of the textual witnesses. But I'm also cutting down, the biggest limiter here is time. I'm not considering anything past the 8th century. So here in this row, you'll see that I have the century for each of the witnesses. And I will not have anything above the 8th century. There's not going to be any 9th century, 10th century, 11th century, whatever. And that is because I am taking the general position that a good many textual scholars would, and that is that text should be weighed such that the generally earlier manuscripts have greater weights than the later manuscripts, even to the point of saying that the later manuscripts are really incidental and unimportant to establishing the earliest text. So here you have a 7th century, here's an 8th century, but you'll never see a 9th century manuscript in this list, or 10th century, or 11th century, or any of those. And that's just one of the things that if you're going to do a meaningful statistical analysis, you have to get rid of extraneous data. And that's one of my problems with CBGM, is they don't count any data as extraneous, which means that their data is that the results are going to be influenced by extraneous data. That's a major problem with any statistical method. And like I said, CBGM makes the same problem that stylometric analysis does. It assumes that similarity has something to do with relatedness, and that just is not necessarily true. So that is not what I'm going to be analyzing. What I'm going to be analyzing is points of agreement, and basically seeing if within this large body of manuscripts and witnesses, if I can find kind of a smaller body that will run through all of the data and find some general principles that will tie everything together to kind of fill in the gaps where these scholars disagree. Major undertaking. I'm not saying that I'm going to finish, but if I can, it'll be pretty cool. And if I can do it in a really useful way, it'd be nice to basically be able to plug a variance into some kind of an algorithm on the spreadsheet and say, if we're going to be consistent with everything else that's out there, this would be the preferred reading based on what's put in. It would be nice to do that, and I'm not against using computer analysis. I just want people to be smarter about the way that they use it. And I do not like the coherence-based genealogical method because it doesn't deal with the problem of significant variance. Significant variance, like I said, there is theological and emotional weight attached to them, so they are not going to be traced through history like the other ones are. I think CBGM is actually pretty useful when it comes to a lot of the common kinds of variants that we see in the New Testament text. A lot of the smaller ones, less notable ones that don't really affect meaning and translation that much. Yeah, CBGM is a fantastic tool for those ones. But even the people who are putting CBGM together and working on it have admitted that it really is not designed to deal with the issue of the significant variants, the weighty variants, the ones that have emotional and theological baggage attached to them. And that's what I'm basically trying to look at here, is these are the ones that are going to impact translation the most, and also people's sermons the most. You know, do we preach this passage or not? If I'm teaching through the Lord's Prayer, do I include that extra portion at the end or not? And why? Can I give a solid reason for that? And there are some people out there that could, but the vast majority of people couldn't, and part of it is just interest and knowledge that it's actually an issue. But it would be nice if I could actually, after analyzing all the data and putting everything and synthesizing everything, if I could actually put together something that would be simple enough to run on, you know, just a normal spreadsheet that could pop out an answer as to what is the most correct and give a basic reason as to why in some way, shape, or form. That would be really cool. Am I going to get around to it? Am I going to be able to accomplish it? I wouldn't want to make any guarantees just because it's a really long process. Like I said, first I have to find all the points of agreement of the scholars that I'm looking at, the sources that I'm looking at. That's going to take a while. And then after I do that, I'm going to have to go through and actually fill in where all of these different witnesses stand with regard to each of the textual variants. And that is going to take a very long time, because for some of the variants, there's 50 plus witnesses that you have to look through that will be in this body of data. And I have to go through each and every one of them by hand, and that takes forever because this data isn't kind of already pre-organized somewhere. So I'm going to have to do it. And then after that comes all of the mathematical analysis and all those kinds of things. So it's very, 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 very long process. And what I'll probably wind up doing is probably breaking it down into chunks. So instead of tackling the entire New Testament, what I'm going to do is basically handle it according to how the New Testament was transcribed generally. The New Testament usually was not transcribed as a whole New Testament. That was very rare. In fact, out of nearly, not quite, but nearly 6,000 Greek New Testament manuscripts that we have, only about 60, and it's actually a little less than 60, it's like 59 or something like that, but less than 60 of them, out of about 6,000, a little less than 6,000, are actually complete New Testament texts. That's basically 1% of all New Testament manuscripts are of the entire New Testament. Most of them are of portions. So you'll have usually collections, but not the entire New Testament, but little collections that will be transcribed. So one collection will be, say, the Gospels, and it will be transcribed as a set of Gospels. And then you'll have the Book of Acts. It's kind of its own thing. It has a weird textual history. It gets transcribed on its own. Then there are the Pauline epistles, and they usually get transcribed as their own. there's also the Catholic epistles. They get transcribed as their own little set. And then there's the book of Revelation, which a lot of people in church history just simply didn't transcribe, which is really weird. There's actually very few copies of Revelation. There's only I think it's less than 300. Like I said, about 6,000 New Testament manuscripts, but only about 300 of them are of the book of Revelation. But anyway, so what I'm going to do is probably going to follow that pattern. So the first thing that I'm going to do is going to do an analysis of the Gospels. And then after that, probably do Acts. And then I'll probably just go in the general New Testament order that we're used to. The historical order is a little bit different, of course, but probably do the general order that we're used to. And then just kind of put it out piece by piece and see if I can do it that way. Because if I try to do everything all at once, I'm probably never going to finish. But having something, I think, would be better than nothing. And now, is anyone going to pay attention to it or really care? Probably not. But I think that it would be something that would be useful for people. So that is one of the projects that I'm working on. And it is a massive, massive project. And like I said, I'm already at nearly 500 witnesses that I'd be analyzing. And of course, you see these data slots are empty because I haven't filled anything in yet. But it's going to have to be more than that because, like I said, some witnesses actually technically contain more than one witness. Where's a good example of one that is like that? Here's a good example. Aleph. Codex Sinaiticus, a rather either famous or infamous New Testament text, depending on which side of the aisle you stand on. But it is a text that has lots of corrections in it. And so there's the original text, which counts as one set of readings. Then there's the different correctors that each count as their own set of readings. And so this is going to actually have to be broken down into multiple columns. So this is alpha original, this is alpha first corrector, second corrector, third corrector, so on down. And a lot of the major uncials, a lot of the ones that are in this category of uncial texts, I'm going to have to do that with. This is the original reader's text, this is the corrector's reading, and so on and so forth. So that's going to be fun. Not really. But yeah, when I'm done, I'll probably have maybe up to 500 different witnesses. And that's another thing I'm going to have to take into account is the church fathers. They often at times have divided witnesses as well, because there's usually a Latin and a Greek version of the church father, and the Latin and the Greek versions do not usually agree. And so I'm going to have to count those separately. And then there's places even within a church father will they disagree with themselves. In those cases, I'm just going to kind of have to count as a null, that they didn't really come out on one side or the other because they actually came out on both. They're a testament to the fact that a given reading existed at an early time, however early that particular person happens to be, or at least the transcription of it was. But beyond that, in places where the church fathers divided on how they quote something, they're not terribly useful in those cases. So it'll be really, really, really interesting to see how this all turns out. I want to see which witnesses actually are the most reliable as far as those sure cases where all the different scholars are in agreement. A lot of people would bet, and I would bet this way as well, but a lot of people would say that some of the kind of the characteristic unsealed text will probably come out pretty high. So like Aleph is probably going to be high. B, which is Codex Vaticanus, is probably going to be even higher. Codex C, Ephraemi Rescriptus, is also probably going to be fairly high. But that's looking at things now. This is actually having a solid set of data behind it to point to and say, this is how it actually turns out. It would be interesting if those ones didn't turn out to be the most reliable ones. It'd be kind of interesting to see if, some kind of a no-name manuscript like 091 actually came out to be one of the more reliable ones as far as these sure cases are concerned. You never know what you're going to get until you actually go through and do the data, but it might actually turn out that a 6th century manuscript might generally, at least in these body of this kind of variant, the significant variants, it might actually turn out that it's more reliable than anything else. But like I said, you're not going to know until you go through and do the analysis. So that is kind of my crazy, weird brain and one of the projects that I'm thinking of doing. And like I said, I'm not making any promises that I'm going to get any portion of it done, but that's one of the things that I'm thinking about that I think would be helpful. CBGM does have some good aspects to it, but it still worries me because it is basically a comparison of relatedness. It's not something that actually weighs the manuscripts themselves. Instead, it looks for similarities and assumes that those similarities and some, and actually not some, complete movements from one, indications of direction are valid. And like I said, statistically speaking, that's not a valid statistic. Whoever put CBGM together either was unaware of a lot of the problems that occur with, say, stylometric analysis and the issue of similarity not being relatedness and those kinds of things. It's like the person who put it together never studied errors in statistical thought. And that greatly worries me. Like I said, for the vast majority of textual variants, CBGM will be a very good thing, because the vast majority of textual variants are basically not significant, and the idea of similarity and relatedness actually applies more in those cases, because there's not that emotional and theological weight. But the more theological and emotional weight a given variant has, the less likely it is going to follow it. The patterns of relation are actually going to follow patterns of similarity. Which, of course, me talking as a screen is in front of you might not make a whole lot of sense, and so hopefully I'll have a time to actually show you how that all actually works out. This will be much further in the future, but things to think about. Anyways, thank you for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. Though for those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to the Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.